The Wraith spoke. Gluttony and temperance, it said. It always depends on the objective. Again and again, it depends on the objective. The extremes provided are so specific. They are all to reflect a system of social guidance, but they are so specific. Gluttony is casually taken to mean an unbounded and unregulated hunger for food, but of course it means an unregulated hunger for anything. But it means nothing if it isn't applied to a scale, so it means obesity, drunkenness. The Roman orgy is the epitome of gluttony. Food till people are sick, wine till people are sick, sex till they fall asleep from inebriation and exhaustion. Gluttony in this society is increasingly represented by unbridled consumerism. It is not that people are taught to consume no more than they need. It is that people are taught to consume as much as they possibly can. The entire socio-economic system of this society is literally a scaled representation of a Roman orgy, right down to the slave servants whose living depends on keeping it all going. The ability for some people to get fat has historically been a symbol of status. They could afford to do that. They could afford that much food. They didn't have to do the manual labor that would burn it off. They lived a life of leisure, and others did the work for them. And not only that, but they were clever enough to not even have to worry about their own physical weakness. Their income allowed them even to hire others to protect their basic physical safety to the extent that they didn't have to even pretend. Think about it. No animal in nature may become so physically incapacitated that they can no longer defend themselves, whether that be running or fighting or climbing a tree or leaping into a hole that the threat is too big to enter. Humans are animals, and no society of humans ever achieved wealth and security through being fat. It's only ever afterwards they get fat, through the ease of the security they have learned. The moment they start getting fat is the beginning of their downward slide, where security becomes eroded from the heart, but it is unseen because no one is looking there anymore. The mind has shifted and now focuses on the trappings and on the sense of entitlement that comes with being born into something and never knowing anything different. And what is taught in that situation? The excellence of the state, the tenets that underlie the preferred reflections. And meanwhile, the actual mechanism wilts and becomes unfocused. It is no longer the lived reality. Now the lived reality is different. It is reflective rather than direct. The man stopped for a moment to watch the sand fall, to watch the lives pass through death's cloak. Then he said, I would say gluttony is needless consumption, the consumption that takes place simply for growth. Not growth of specific considered traits that need feeding in order to grow, but rather just growth. And so people grow what they find they can grow, no longer shackled by need, by the absolute survival necessity to channel energy and resource to the most directly useful place. Growth can be of want, whatever people want, or more to the point, in practice, whatever people can be told they want, whatever people can be convinced they want, whatever people want that they didn't even know they wanted, whatever people can be made reliant on, all of it. All of it gets made so as to entice, so as to normalize over time, generationally even, the pretended notion that there's a value in simple consumption. I don't mean that in any light way either. That value of growth through consumption is presented as some sort of divinity, as a moral good in and of itself. Needless consumption has become a god figure itself. And it isn't just food. It isn't just that people have got to the point where they actually encourage physical obesity through celebration of it, all in the name of subjectivity. No, it goes way further than that. People are now immersed in rooms, warehouses of material to be consumed. It's like people don't even have to eat anymore because they are living in a virtual environment where their minds are directly trickle-fed sensory information that triggers their brains just like eating did. Endless trails of colored candies, each full of addictive refined sugars that offer no nutrition whatsoever, only the most basic fuel to keep the brain tapped into the feed and ticking over. That is gluttony, the disconnection of want from need. And now that disconnection is becoming codified through the distorted norms that have been and are being developed to take perception to be the same as actuality. What could possibly be more contemptuous of life, or of reality, of truth, than the suggestion that we humans, or more specifically humans of this particular society, have the luxury of disregarding actuality and placing individualized perception as actuality's equal or rightful replacement? And everyone has their form of it. Everyone wants their junk food. Everyone wants their junk media feed. And the shareholders capitalize off it while stuffing themselves with their own gluttonous enticements. Where is there room for temperance in that environment? Well, there is room for it. It has to be there. Everyone has to have some area where they can claim temperance so as to avert consideration of their gluttony, so that they can excuse their gluttony. Nowadays, things have become so mixed up that simply being nice is sufficient. The Wraith looked over at the man, who noticed. I'm saying it's enough for people to be nice. No one cares about anything so long as no one questions what they're doing. In other words, they smile, or at least are not noticeably threatening. That is enough. What I'm saying is, temperance is to be nice. The Wraith played along, sacrificed a pawn to feed the man. Temperance, surely, is not simply to be nice. The man's knight, disgusted by disrespect, struck down the pawn. The man said, "You just contradicted me. It isn't nice to contradict people, to call them wrong. But that is exactly what I'm talking about. The term has become meaningless. Obviously, temperance is about need. It's about taking energy seriously, about taking care over investment, about saving for later. It's about foresight. It's about expending only what's necessary to expend in order to achieve a task. And that means temperance is about efficiency, which means temperance is about thinking and consideration, which means temperance is about actuality and not about perception. It is about aligning perception with actuality rather than recklessly allowing a presumption of actuality based on blinded perception. It is about thinking before speaking. It is about determining what is required. It is about being strong and also lean. It is about capability. All of those aspects of what temperance means have been whittled away until it has come to mean simply being nice to people. The Wraith tested. I'm not sure that is sufficient. Remember, I hear the stories of people. Well, let me imagine what you might be getting at. The most obvious fit is that you have met people who considered themselves to embody temperance and they bored you. Perhaps something of the kind, the Wraith replied evenly with the steady flow of the sand. Yeah, forced temperance can be pretty disturbing, which is to say it can be spoiled. It is not to say that traits cannot be grafted onto people. It's like when liberal democracies, a state of social governance that takes centuries to evolve, decide they're going to just create others in their image, and they try to graft on their systems, their bureaucracies, and outside the walls are open sewers and latent civil war. It is incredibly presumptuous. But it is no more presumptuous than organizations preaching purity of behavior while collecting fleets of expensive cars, or seeing prostitutes in seedy motels, or getting hooked on pharmaceutical or other drugs, or whipping people, or molesting people, or bullying people, or whatever other fucked up shit goes on. I'm not saying that the best way to become something isn't to mimic it, but to pretend to already be it, that's a different story. And when I hear histories of families of people that were supposed to be seriously religious, following the way of Christ, for example, with a hardcore fanaticism, but then clearly exhibiting shocking examples of abusive behavior, I mean, it boggles me. Sometimes the gaps are just so huge, it is difficult to even imagine how people who are getting it so wrong thought they were so utterly right. Mental illness is the answer. Mental illness characterized by a clear inability to distinguish actuality from perception. People, in the name of temperance, can get to some pretty crazy places. Is that what you are getting at? I notice it. I'm not surprised. The man sat quietly for a time in thought. The Wraith waited in the hushed silence of the sand. Eventually, the man, mustering his thought to his voice, continued. Gluttonous temperance. That's interesting. The difference, I mean. Gluttony and temperance and gluttony. But of course it brings back into play the notion of to what it is directed. Perhaps temperance and gluttony is the realization of imperfection, the humble recognition of where a person stands, and the avoidance of pretending to be something else, something more perfect. Temperance, after all, would require an honest assessment of condition. That's where those hardcore people go wrong. They fail to appreciate they're just fucked up monkeys playing at being gods. The Wraith said, Yet you take issue with your own gluttony. It's true, I do. It bothers me to be susceptible. but I can't outright deny it. When I think of times when I did, well, I see too much of that person I don't like, so I maintain my imperfections, perhaps so as to channel them. It is easier to measure and monitor imperfections when they are channeled. I don't mind having imperfections. That's not true. I do mind it. I just have to accept it, but I do want to be aware of them. My imperfection is my affiliation with fire, my need to honor fire, the destructive side of my father's own version of what the wolf is to me. I accept that fire plays a role in my life. It keeps me warm and it keeps me honest, and it brings me ever closer to you, which brings me ever closer to my Father, who is light. I just don't want to pretend. I think others should not pretend. Collectively, we pretend so much that we are going to lose the good that was built to something less good, just because it is more honest at its core. It makes me sick to think about it. All of the good lost, just because people want everyone to be nice. To help them pretend, to reinforce their idea that they're fine, and not only fine, but beautiful, and to be encouraged in whatever idea they have, whatever they seek to pursue, whatever perception of themselves they have, as though it is reality. It is itself sickness in action. It means that nothing matters but what we choose to adopt for ourselves. Every other view is meaningless the moment it doesn't comport with the desired or imagined self-image. The man stopped and shuffled small dunes of sand around on an empty area of the board. He was frustrated. Death watched his irritation but said nothing. Eventually, the man rose up from the board and leaned back in his chair. He looked at the Wraith and said, "I guess that brings us to wrath and patience." The Wraith spoke. Wrath and patience.